In the scorching summer of 1876, near the shores of Thunder Bay, in what would become Minnesota territory, a massacre unfolded that should have been recorded as just another brutal statistic in the violent clash between settlers and outlaws plaguing the northern frontier. The notorious Iron Snake Gang's raid on the Henderson trading post left 14 people dead, their bodies scattered across the blood-soaked prairie like broken dolls. At least that's what Territorial Marshal reported after counting the corpses and burying them in unmarked graves. But what Marshal Donovan never discovered were 10-year-old twins, Jacob and Rebecca Henderson, two children who witnessed their family's slaughter from inside a shattered freight wagon and survived 43 days in the wilderness under the protection of an Ojibwe war chief who had every reason to let them die. This is the extraordinary true account of how two terrified children became something far more dangerous than the Desperados who destroyed their world, and how an unlikely alliance between enemies would reshape the destiny of an entire territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Morning of July 15th, 1876, dawned with the kind of oppressive heat that made even the hardiest frontier settlers question their sanity in choosing to build lives on the Minnesota prairie. But inside the Henderson trading post, the largest mercantile establishment between Fort Snelling and the Canadian border, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement and profitable activity. Samuel Henderson wiped sweat from his forehead as he tallied the morning's receipts, his weathered hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had built a thriving business from nothing but determination and fair dealing. At 45, he had transformed a single-room cabin into a sprawling complex that served trappers, farmers, traveling merchants, and even occasional military patrols with equal hospitality and honest prices. The trading post consisted of the main store building, a substantial log structure that housed everything from ammunition and farming tools to exotic spices and bolts of fine cloth imported from Chicago. Attached warehouses stored grain, pelts, and manufactured goods, awaiting transport to markets in St. Paul. Behind the commercial buildings stood the Henderson family residence, a comfortable two-story home that represented everything Samuel had, achieved through 20 years of frontier entrepreneurship. But Samuel Henderson's greatest pride wasn't his commercial success. It was his family. His wife, Margaret, managed the post's books with mathematical precision that impressed even the territorial tax collectors, while somehow maintaining a home that visiting dignitaries described as more civilized and welcoming than establishments. In major cities, their 10-year-old twins, Jacob and Rebecca, represented the future Samuel was building. Unlike many frontier children who grew up wild and uneducated, the Henderson twins received instruction that combined practical frontier skills with formal education ordered from Boston schools. Jacob demonstrated remarkable mechanical aptitude, able to repair complex farming equipment and even modify firearms with innovations that impressed experienced gunsmiths. Rebecca possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations, a gift that made her invaluable in the delicate negotiations that kept their trading post neutral in a region where competing interests often led to violence. The twins had inherited their parents' best qualities while developing unique abilities that set them apart from typical frontier children. Jacob's analytical mind approached problems with systematic precision, whether calculating optimal gear ratios for mill equipment or determining the most efficient layout for warehouse storage. Rebecca's intuitive understanding of human nature allowed her to predict customer behavior, identify potential troublemakers, and even mediate disputes between rival trapping parties. On this particular morning, The trading post hosted an unusual gathering that reflected Samuel Henderson's reputation for maintaining peaceful neutrality in a volatile region. French-Canadian trappers shared breakfast with German immigrant farmers, while Mexican traders examined samples of Minnesota timber alongside representatives from Eastern lumber companies. This diverse mix of customers required careful management, but the Hendersons had perfected the art of keeping potential enemies focused on profitable business rather than old grievances. Jacob worked in the main store, helping customers locate merchandise, while his sharp eyes catalogued inventory needs and potential security concerns. His mechanical mind automatically noted which visitors carried new firearms, which seemed nervous or secretive, and which displayed the telltale signs of men running from something dangerous. Rebecca assisted her mother with the complex bookkeeping that tracked transactions in 3 currencies: American dollars, British pounds, and the informal credit system that governed much frontier commerce. But her real value lay in her ability to read the emotional undercurrents that could transform routine business into deadly confrontation. She possessed an uncanny talent for identifying which customers might cause trouble and steering them toward mutually beneficial solutions. The success of Henderson Trading Post depended on maintaining strict neutrality in a region where various factions competed for control. Samuel had established his business as a demilitarized zone where enemies could conduct necessary trade without violence, a policy that required constant diplomatic skill and occasional enforcement through strategic alliances with local authorities. But on this sweltering July morning, that carefully maintained neutrality was about to be shattered by forces beyond any peaceful merchant's ability to control. At approximately 10:30 that morning, 11 riders approached Henderson Trading Post. From the south, their dust cloud visible for miles across the flat prairie landscape. But these weren't typical customers seeking supplies or trade goods. They were members of the most feared criminal organization operating in the Northern Territories, the Iron Snake Gang, led by a former Confederate cavalry officer whose reputation for calculated brutality had earned him a bounty larger than most men's annual income. Captain Ezekiel Thornfield, the gang's founder and absolute leader, had transformed military discipline and tactical expertise into criminal efficiency that terrorized law enforcement across 3 territories. Unlike typical outlaw bands that relied on random violence and crude intimidation, the Iron Snake Gang operated with precision that made them nearly impossible to capture and absolutely lethal to oppose. Thornfield himself rode at the head of his men with the bearing of a professional soldier, his Confederate officer's uniform modified for frontier conditions but still recognizably military. His pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had killed in warfare and found the transition to civilian murder disappointingly easy. At 38, he commanded absolute loyalty from followers who understood that their leaders' strategic brilliance was the only thing standing between them and territorial gallows. The gang's membership represented a carefully selected collection of specialists recruited for specific skills rather than mere willingness to commit violence. Former soldiers provided tactical expertise and weapons proficiency. Displaced Indians offered tracking abilities and knowledge of terrain that allowed the gang to vanish into wilderness areas where conventional pursuit became impossible. Professional criminals contributed expertise in safe-cracking, forgery, and the complex logistics of converting stolen goods into usable currency. What made the Iron Snake Gang particularly dangerous was their systematic approach to criminal enterprise. They operated like a military unit, conducting warfare against civilian targets, using reconnaissance, coordinated attacks, and strategic withdrawal to maximize profit while minimizing risk. Their reputation for leaving no witnesses alive wasn't mere cruelty. It was sound, tactical doctrine that prevented testimony from reaching territorial courts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The gang had chosen Henderson Trading Post as their target after weeks of careful surveillance and planning. The establishment's reputation for neutrality and substantial cash reserves made it an attractive prize, while its isolated location reduced the likelihood of immediate military response. Most importantly, intelligence gathered from corrupt officials indicated that the post currently held the territorial government's quarterly tax collection, over $15,000 in gold and currency, waiting for escort to St. Paul. But Thornfield's intelligence had failed to account for one crucial factor that would transform a routine robbery into a catastrophe that would haunt him for the rest of his violent life. Thornfield studied the trading post through field glasses as his men took positions around the complex. The morning's customer activity provided perfect cover for their approach. Numerous horses and wagons created confusion that masked the gang's military precision. But the captain's experienced eye detected subtle signs that suggested the Henderson establishment might offer more resistance than anticipated. The men moving around the buildings carried themselves with the confident bearing of experienced fighters rather than typical frontier merchants. Several wore military-style gun belts and moved with the coordinated awareness of people accustomed to potential violence. Most significantly, the trading post's layout had been designed with defensive considerations that suggested Samuel Henderson understood his business, attracted dangerous attention. "Something's not right here, Captain," observed Sergeant Walsh, Thornfield's second in command, and a former Army scout whose survival instincts had been honed by years of Indian fighting. "Too many men, too well armed. This might not be the easy target we expected." Thornfield nodded grimly. His intelligence had portrayed Henderson Trading Post as a prosperous but essentially defenseless commercial establishment. The reality suggested something closer to a frontier fortress manned by experienced fighters who wouldn't surrender without a costly battle. But the Iron Snake Gang had committed too much planning and traveled too far to abandon their objective. Based on mere caution, Thornfield had built his reputation on completing difficult operations that other outlaw bands considered impossible. Retreat at this point would damage his leadership and encourage territorial authorities to pursue more aggressive countermeasures. "We proceed as planned," Thornfield decided, "but expect resistance. No prisoners, no witnesses, no mercy. We finish this quickly and thoroughly." Samuel Henderson was examining a shipment of new Winchester rifles when his daughter Rebecca appeared, at his elbow with an expression that immediately commanded his attention. At 10 years old, she had developed an uncanny ability to sense danger that had prevented several potentially disastrous confrontations in the past. "Papa," she whispered urgently, "the riders coming from the south aren't customers. Something's wrong with them." Samuel set down the rifle he had been inspecting and moved to the store's front window, where he could observe the approaching dust cloud without revealing his own position. Through his field glasses, he studied the 11 horsemen with growing alarm. Their formation was too precise for casual travelers, their pace too deliberate for customers in a hurry. Most telling was their leader's bearing, the ramrod-straight posture and tactical positioning that screamed military training. "Jacob," Samuel called quietly to his son, who was organizing inventory in the rear of the store. "Come here immediately, but stay low." The boy obeyed instantly, his mechanical mind already calculating possibilities based on his father's tone and his sister's obvious concern. Jacob had inherited his father's analytical nature along with an intuitive understanding of machinery and systems that extended to reading human behavior patterns. "Rebecca, go tell your mother to secure the strongbox and prepare the emergency signals," Samuel instructed, his voice remaining calm, despite the growing certainty that they faced immediate danger. "Jacob, help me distribute weapons to the customers who can be trusted." The trading post's current customers included 8 men, whose loyalties Samuel felt confident about: 3 French-Canadian trappers who had conducted business with the Hendersons for over a decade, 2 German farmers whose families had been helped through difficult winters, and 3 Mexican traders whose relationship with the post dated back to its founding. All were experienced frontier fighters who understood that survival sometimes required immediate cooperation against common threats. Samuel moved efficiently through the store, distributing rifles and ammunition while explaining the situation. In terse whispers, the response was immediate and unified. These men had survived on the frontier precisely because they could recognize and respond to deadly threats without hesitation. Margaret Henderson appeared from the residence carrying a small strongbox containing their most essential documents and emergency funds, her face pale but determined. She had endured 20 years of frontier life and understood that their family's survival might depend on decisions made in the next few minutes. "The territorial patrol isn't due for another week," she reported quietly. "We're completely on our own." Samuel nodded grimly. The Henderson trading post's success depended partly on its reputation for peaceful neutrality, but that same reputation might have made them a target for criminals who assumed they would offer minimal resistance. It was time to demonstrate that. Neutrality didn't mean defenselessness. Through the front window, the approaching riders had resolved into individual figures whose appearance confirmed Samuel's worst fears. These weren't desperate amateurs driven to crime by circumstances. They were professional killers, led by someone with obvious military experience. The precision of their formation and the quality of their equipment suggested resources and organization that made them far more dangerous than typical outlaw bands. "Papa," Rebecca whispered, her young face tight with concentration. "The leader's planning something terrible. I can see it in how he sits his horse. This isn't just robbery." Samuel felt ice form in his stomach. His daughter's ability to read people had never been wrong, and if she sensed that the approaching gang intended more than simple theft, their situation was even more desperate than he had calculated. The Iron Snake Gang reined up approximately 50 yards from the trading post's main building, their horses forming a loose semicircle that cut off the most obvious escape routes. Captain Thornfield dismounted with casual confidence, his hand resting on his sidearm, but making no overtly threatening gestures. "Henderson!" he called out in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Aye, know you're in there. Come out so we can discuss business like civilized men." Samuel exchanged glances with the armed customers who had positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the store. Everyone understood that this was no ordinary robbery attempt. The gang leader's tone suggested negotiations were merely a formality before violence began. "What kind of business?" Samuel called back, buying time while his defenders completed their preparations. Thornfield smiled, a cold expression that never reached his pale eyes. "The kind where you hand over your cash reserves and territorial tax collection, and maybe everybody walks away breathing. Refuse, and we'll burn this place down with everyone inside." The ultimatum hung in the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Samuel Henderson realized that his family's 20 years of careful neutrality had finally been shattered by forces beyond any merchant's ability to control. The Iron Snake Gang hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to take everything and kill anyone who witnessed their crime. Samuel Henderson's response came not in words, but in action. The trading post erupted in gunfire as 8 rifles opened simultaneously from carefully prepared positions, their coordinated volley designed to eliminate as many attackers as possible before the gang could organize effective retaliation. 2 Iron Snake Gang members fell immediately, their horses rearing in panic as bullets found their marks. But Captain Thornfield had anticipated potential resistance and planned accordingly. His remaining men wheeled their mounts behind cover while returning disciplined fire that demonstrated their military training and superior positioning. The battle that followed lasted 47 minutes and transformed Henderson Trading Post from a peaceful commercial establishment into a charnel house that would haunt survivors' nightmares for decades. The Iron Snake Gang's tactical superiority became apparent within the first few exchanges. They had reconnaissance advantage, numerical superiority, and most critically, a leader whose strategic brilliance had been honed by years of successful criminal operations. Samuel Henderson died defending the main store's entrance, his body shielding customers who had trusted his leadership. Margaret Henderson fell while attempting to reach her children, cut down by crossfire as she ran between buildings. One by one, the brave men who had volunteered to fight found themselves overwhelmed by opponents whose coordination and firepower exceeded anything they had expected to face. But in the chaos of battle, 10-year-old twins Jacob and Rebecca Henderson discovered something their parents couldn't have anticipated, a survival instinct that transcended their civilized upbringing and tapped into primal abilities that would keep them alive when everyone else perished. As the gunfight raged around the main buildings, the twins had taken refuge in an overturned freight wagon behind the trading post's main warehouse. The massive wooden vehicle, designed to haul heavy cargo across rough terrain, provided substantial protection while offering concealment from the gang members who were systematically hunting down survivors. From their hiding place, Jacob and Rebecca witnessed horrors that no children should ever see. They watched their parents die. They saw family friends cut down without mercy. They observed the methodical execution of wounded defenders who posed no further threat. Through gaps in the wagon's damaged siding, they witnessed Captain Thornfield personally shoot 3 men who had attempted to surrender, but the twins also observed something that would prove crucial to their survival: the Iron Snake Gang's systematic approach to eliminating evidence. Thornfield ordered his men to search every building, every hiding place, every possible refuge where witnesses might be concealing themselves. The gang leader understood that allowing survivors to reach territorial authorities would eventually bring military retaliation that could destroy his organization. "Find everyone," Thornfield commanded as his men began their grisly search. "I want bodies counted and accounted for. No one leaves here alive to tell stories." Jacob felt his sister's hand grip his with desperate strength as they pressed themselves against the wagon's far wall, trying to become invisible while gang members methodically searched the trading post's buildings. The 10-year-old boy's analytical mind worked frantically, calculating distances to potential escape routes while evaluating their chances of reaching safety undetected. Rebecca's intuitive abilities proved equally valuable in their desperate situation. She somehow sensed when searchers were approaching their wagon and when they had moved to other areas, guiding her brother through whispered warnings that kept them concealed during the most dangerous moments. The search continued for over an hour as Thornfield's men combed through every structure, every storage area, every possible hiding place where survivors might be found. They discovered and killed 2 wounded defenders who had been attempting to crawl to safety. They shot a terrified Mexican trader who had hidden in a grain bin. They even executed the trading post's elderly cook who had taken refuge in the root cellar. But they never found the overturned freight wagon where 2 children lay in paralyzed terror, watching their world die around them. As evening approached and the Iron Snake Gang prepared to depart with their stolen wealth, Jacob and Rebecca remained hidden in their wagon refuge, too terrified to move, despite growing certainty that the immediate danger had passed. They had listened to the sounds of systematic looting, of buildings being searched and ransacked, of horses being prepared for travel. Finally, as darkness began to settle over the prairie, they heard the gang riding away toward the north, their hoofbeats gradually fading until only silence remained. But the twins didn't emerge immediately. Rebecca's instincts warned that some gang members might have remained behind to watch for exactly such movement. They waited until full darkness, before Jacob carefully peered through gaps in the wagon's damaged siding. The trading post building stood as dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky, no lights visible, no sounds of human activity. The complex that had been their home and their family's life work now resembled a ghost town populated only by the dead. "I think they're gone," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible even to his sister. Rebecca nodded, though her young face remained tight with concentration. "But we can't stay here. Someone might come back, and when the territorial patrol arrives—" She didn't finish the thought, but Jacob understood. When authorities discovered the massacre, they would assume that everyone at the trading post had been killed. The twins would be listed among the dead, and no one would search for survivors who officially didn't exist. Carefully, quietly, they emerged from their hiding place and surveyed the devastation around them. The main store building had been thoroughly ransacked, its contents scattered across the prairie. The warehouse had been burned, probably to destroy evidence of what had been stolen. Bodies lay where they had fallen, already attracting scavengers from the surrounding wilderness. Jacob forced himself to think systematically, despite the emotional trauma threatening to overwhelm his young mind. They needed supplies, weapons, and most importantly, a plan for survival that didn't depend on rescue that would never come. From the ruins of their home, they salvaged what they could. A canvas tarp, some dried meat that had been overlooked by the looters, a small knife, their father's field glasses, and surprisingly, a revolver that had fallen behind an overturned counter. Jacob checked the weapon with mechanical precision, finding 4 loaded chambers that represented their only protection against a hostile wilderness. Rebecca contributed items that reflected her different but equally valuable perspective. Their mother's sewing kit, which contained thread and needles essential for equipment repair, a small mirror that could be used for signaling, and most importantly, a detailed map of the region that showed water sources, settlements, and traditional Indian territories. "Where do we go?" Jacob asked, as they studied the map by moonlight. Rebecca considered their options with the same intuitive insight that had kept them hidden during the massacre. Not south toward Fort Snelling. The gang went north, but they might circle back. "That way, not east toward the settlements. We'd never make it that far on foot. West." She paused, her finger tracing routes across the map's surface. "West toward the Ojibwe territories. Papa always said they were honorable people who respected courage." "Maybe," Jacob nodded slowly. It was a desperate plan based on hope rather than certainty, but their alternatives were even more uncertain. They were 10 years old, alone in a wilderness that killed experienced adults, with winter approaching and no guarantee that anyone would help them, even if they survived long enough to find civilization. As they prepared to abandon the only home they had ever known, neither twin could have imagined that their desperate flight would lead them to an encounter that would transform them from terrified refugees into something far more dangerous than the outlaws who had destroyed their family. The broken freight wagon that had sheltered them through their darkest hour now stood empty in the moonlight, a silent witness to the end of childhood and the beginning of a journey that would remake the Minnesota frontier. The twins began their westward trek just after midnight, using darkness to conceal their movement, while the clear sky provided enough starlight for navigation. Jacob carried their salvage supplies in a makeshift pack created from their mother's sewing basket, while Rebecca used her father's field glasses to scout ahead for potential dangers or opportunities. Their pace was necessarily slow. 2 10-year-old Children couldn't match the speed of mounted adults, and their survival depended on avoiding detection rather than covering maximum distance. But they possessed advantages that adult refugees might have lacked. Small size that made concealment easier, flexibility that allowed them to navigate terrain that would challenge larger travelers, and most importantly, desperate motivation that drove them beyond normal physical limitations. The first 3 days of their journey tested every survival skill their frontier upbringing had provided. They navigated by stars and landmarks, rationed their meager food supplies with mathematical precision, and found water sources using techniques their father had taught them during hunting expeditions. Most critically, they learned to read the prairie landscape for signs of human activity that might represent either salvation or deadly threat. By the 4th day, their situation had become desperate. Their food supplies were nearly exhausted, their improvised equipment was failing, and Rebecca had developed a fever that sapped her strength and clouded her usually sharp judgment. Jacob realized that his sister's condition was deteriorating rapidly and that they would both die unless they found help soon. It was then, as they sheltered beneath an overturned tree during a fierce thunderstorm, that Jacob first noticed they were being followed. The signs were subtle, disturbed grass that suggested careful tracking, glimpses of movement at the edge of his vision, the feeling of being observed that raised primitive alarm instincts. But whoever was following them possessed skills that far exceeded any white tracker Jacob had encountered. The pursuit was so expertly conducted that he might have dismissed his suspicions as paranoia, if not for Rebecca's growing certainty that unseen eyes were watching their every movement. "Someone's out there," she whispered during their second night of awareness, her fever-bright eyes scanning the darkness beyond their inadequate shelter. "Following us, but not trying to catch us. Watching, learning." Jacob felt fear and hope war within his chest. If they were being tracked by Iron Snake Gang members, their flight would end in capture and execution. But if their mysterious shadow belonged to someone else, perhaps territorial authorities or even friendly Indians, it might represent their salvation. The answer came on their 6th day of flight, when Rebecca's fever finally broke their careful concealment. Rebecca's fever reached its peak on the 6th morning of their flight, transforming the resilient 10-year-old into a delirious child who could barely walk without Jacob's constant support. Her normally sharp awareness had dissolved into confused rambling that mixed memories of the massacre with fevered hallucinations of their dead parents calling to her from the prairie grass. Jacob felt panic building in his chest as he watched his sister deteriorate. His analytical mind had calculated their dwindling supplies and energy reserves with mathematical precision. They had perhaps 2 days of strength remaining before complete collapse. Rebecca's illness had accelerated their timeline catastrophically, and Jacob understood with cold clarity that they would both die unless help arrived within hours rather than days. They had taken shelter in a shallow depression beneath a stand of young cottonwoods, where Jacob used their canvas tarp to create rudimentary protection from the morning sun. Rebecca lay motionless except for the violent shivering that racked her small frame despite the growing heat of another scorching prairie day. "Mama," she whispered repeatedly, her eyes unfocused and distant. "Mama, why won't you come get us? The bad men are gone now. We can go home." Jacob dampened a piece of cloth with water from their nearly empty canteen and placed it on his sister's burning forehead. He had exhausted every frontier remedy he could remember. Willow bark tea for fever, cool compresses, elevation of her feet. But Rebecca's condition continued worsening despite his desperate efforts. It was then, as he knelt beside his dying sister in their pathetic shelter, that Jacob became aware of a presence that made every primitive instinct scream warnings. Throughout his young body, Someone was watching them from close range, close enough that Jacob could sense their breathing and movement, despite seeing nothing through the screening vegetation around their hiding place. The rational part of his mind insisted that exhaustion and stress were creating paranoid delusions, but his survival instincts, honed by 6 days of constant vigilance, recognized the unmistakable feeling of being observed by intelligent, calculating eyes. Jacob's hand moved slowly toward the revolver, tucked inside his makeshift pack, his fingers closing around the grip while he forced his expression to remain neutral. A voice spoke from directly behind him, so close that Jacob felt breath on his neck despite having heard no approach whatsoever. "Put down the gun, young warrior. If I meant harm, you would already be walking the spirit path." Jacob spun around so quickly that he nearly lost his balance, the revolver appearing in his hands with desperate speed. But the weapon felt utterly inadequate as he found himself staring at a figure that seemed to have materialized from the prairie itself. The man standing less than 3 feet away was clearly Ojibwe, his weathered face marked with traditional tattoos that spoke of warrior status and spiritual authority. He appeared to be in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair braided with feathers and bone ornaments that caught the morning light. Most remarkably, he wore a combination of traditional clothing and carefully selected items from the white world. Buckskin, leggings and shirt adorned with intricate beadwork, but also a military-style gun belt and boots that suggested extensive contact with American forces. What struck Jacob most profoundly was the man's eyes, dark, intelligent, and holding depths of experience that seemed to encompass both great wisdom and terrible knowledge. These were the eyes of someone who had seen much death and learned to navigate between worlds that existed in constant conflict. "I am Many Horses of the Gull Lake Band," the warrior announced with quiet dignity. "War chief, medicine keeper, and guardian of the old ways, in a time when old ways die like grass before fire." Jacob kept the revolver trained on the unexpected visitor, despite recognizing the futility of threatening someone who had approached undetected and could have killed them at any moment. "What do you want with us?" Many Horses gestured toward Rebecca's vivid form with obvious concern. "Your sister walks close to the spirit world. Without proper medicine, she will cross over before another sun sets. You also are near the end of your strength, though pride keeps you standing when wisdom would counsel rest." The Ojibwe war chief's assessment was devastatingly accurate. Jacob felt his own reserves failing as exhaustion and strain took their toll on his young body. They had pushed themselves beyond reasonable limits, surviving on determination and desperation when physical resources had been exhausted days earlier. "Why should you care?" Jacob asked, though his voice carried more confusion than hostility. "We're white children. Your people have no reason to help us." Many Horses studied Jacob with an expression that mixed approval with something that might have been sadness. "Survival creates its own kinship, young one. Also, the spirits have shown me visions of 2 children who carry great purpose, though that purpose remains hidden even from my sight." The war chief moved with fluid grace to Rebecca's side, kneeling beside the fevered girl while producing a leather pouch from his clothing. Jacob watched with growing amazement as Many Horses began preparing what was clearly a sophisticated medical treatment using plants and materials that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. "How long have you been following us?" Jacob asked as the Ojibwe warrior worked with calm efficiency. "Since the second night of your flight," Many Horses replied, without pausing in his ministrations. "I was hunting near the destroyed trading place when the scent of burning reached my nose. Found 14 bodies and much blood, but the spirits whispered that 2 young ones had escaped the slaughter." Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. "You saw what happened to our family?" Many Horses' weathered hands paused in their work, and his expression grew grim. "Iron Snake Gang. I know their sign, their methods. Thornfield leads them like a war chief, but without honor. They leave only death and emptiness wherever they pass. The casual mention of the gang leader's name stunned Jacob. You know, Captain Thornfield, our paths have crossed many times in recent years, Many Horses said simply, but something in his tone suggested a history far more complex and dangerous than casual encounters. He is a man who believes strength comes from causing fear. He has yet to learn that true strength comes from protecting what matters. Many Horses worked with the focused intensity of someone whose knowledge had been gained through decades of treating battlefield wounds and frontier ailments. From his leather pouch, he produced a variety of herbs and prepared substances that he combined with water from a small gourd to create a bitter-smelling tea. This will break the fever and restore her body's balance, he explained, as he carefully supported Rebecca's head and helped her drink the medicine. But healing requires more than plant knowledge. It requires understanding why sickness comes and what it teaches. Jacob watched with fascination as the Ojibwe war chief conducted what was clearly both medical treatment and spiritual ceremony. Many Horses spoke softly in his native language while applying herbal poultices to Rebecca's forehead and wrists, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of traditional chanting. To Jacob's amazement, Rebecca's condition began improving almost immediately. Her violent shivering subsided, her breathing became more regular, and most importantly, her eyes regained focus as the fever-induced delirium faded. Within an hour, she was sitting up and speaking coherently for the first time in days. "Who are you?" Rebecca asked, studying Many Horses with the same intuitive perception that had served her so well at the trading post. "You're not just a medicine man, you're something more." Many Horses smiled with obvious approval. Young one sees clearly even when fever clouds her vision. "Yes, I am war chief of my band, but also keeper of old knowledge and guardian of sacred places. Most importantly for your situation, I am someone who understands what it means to lose everything and begin again." Rebecca's intuitive abilities, restored by the medicine and perhaps enhanced by her recent proximity to death, seemed to perceive layers of meaning that Jacob couldn't access. "You've seen terrible things too. Lost people you loved. That's why you helped us." The war chief's expression grew solemn as memories clearly surfaced from painful depths. 7 winters ago, soldiers attacked our winter camp near Leech Lake, said we were harboring criminals, but truth was they wanted our land for timber companies. My wife and youngest son died in that attack, along with many others who had never raised weapons against any white person. Jacob felt his understanding shift as he grasped the significance of Many Horses' revelation. "You saved us, even though our people killed your family." "Your people?" Many Horses asked with gentle challenge. "Were you among the soldiers who attacked? Innocent families? Did your parents teach you that Indians deserve death for existing? Or are you simply children who happen to be born with pale skin?" The questions forced Jacob to confront assumptions he hadn't even realized he held. Samuel Henderson had indeed taught his children to respect indigenous peoples and to judge individuals by their actions rather than their heritage. The war chief's point was undeniable. The twins bore no responsibility for violence committed by others who shared their skin color. "The spirits do not see the color of skin when they judge the worth of a heart," Many Horses continued. "They see courage, kindness, and the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. You have shown all these qualities during your trials." Rebecca, whose recovery continued with remarkable speed, asked the question that had been building in Jacob's mind. "What happens now? Where can we go?" Many Horses was silent for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting internal deliberation that suggested the answer carried profound implications. When he finally spoke, his words would alter the trajectory of both children's lives in ways none of them could fully anticipate. "You have 3 paths before you," he said slowly. "First, I can guide you to Fort Snelling. where territorial authorities will place you with relatives or send you to institutions for orphaned children. You will be safe, but forever marked as victims of tragedy, living lives that honor neither your parents' memory nor your own potential." He paused, allowing them to consider this option before continuing. "Second, I can take you to peaceful settlements, where kind families might adopt you. You would grow up as ordinary frontier children, knowing nothing of the strength you have already demonstrated or the greater purposes that await your development." Jacob felt anticipation building as he waited for the third option. Many Horses' tone suggested that the final path would be both more challenging and more meaningful than the first two. "Or," the war chief said with growing intensity, "you can. And come with me to learn the old ways alongside the new. You can discover abilities you never knew you possessed, and prepare for a destiny that will require wisdom from all worlds. But this path demands everything: your comfortable assumptions, your easy answers, your childhood itself." Rebecca's response came without hesitation. "What kind of abilities? What destiny?" Many Horses reached into another pouch and withdrew two small objects that he placed in the twins' hands. Jacob found himself holding a carved piece of what appeared to be blackstone, warm to the touch, and inscribed with symbols he didn't recognize. Rebecca received a similar carving made from white stone with different markings. "These are vision stones, created by my grandfather's grandfather when the first white explorers reached our territory," Many Horses explained. "They were made for two children who would someday bridge the gap between peoples who have forgotten how to see beyond the color of skin and the shape of prayers." Jacob examined his stone carving with growing fascination. The material felt almost alive in his hands, and the symbols seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. "How did your ancestors know we would exist?" "Time moves in circles rather than straight lines," Many Horses replied cryptically. "What will be has already been, and what was continues in new forms. Your spirits have walked this path before, in other lives and other bodies. Now they return to complete work that was interrupted by violence and misunderstanding." The concept challenged everything Jacob had been taught about existence and spirituality, but something deep within his consciousness recognized truth in the war chief's words. He exchanged glances with Rebecca and saw similar recognition in her eyes. They were being offered something far more significant than mere survival. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the prairie, Many Horses prepared to depart regardless of the twins' decision. He had fulfilled his obligation to preserve their lives and offer them choices about their future. The responsibility for determining their path now rested entirely with Jacob and Rebecca. "If we come with you?" Jacob asked carefully. "What exactly would we learn?" Many Horses packed his medicine supplies with methodical precision while considering his response. The old ways teach harmony between all living things, how to read the language of wind and water, how to understand what animals and plants communicate to those who listen properly, how to see patterns that connect all events across time and space. He gestured toward the endless prairie surrounding them. "But you would also learn new ways that combine ancient wisdom with tools and knowledge from the white world. How to use the best of both people's understanding to solve problems that neither can handle alone." Rebecca, whose fever had completely broken and whose strength was returning rapidly, asked the most important question. "Would we learn to fight, to protect ourselves and others from people like Thornfield?" Many Horses' expression grew serious as he met her gaze directly. "You would learn that true warriors fight first with wisdom, second with words, and only finally with weapons. But yes, you would learn to defend what matters when defense becomes necessary." The war chief stood and shouldered his pack, preparing for departure. "I leave now for the sacred caves, where my band waits out the hot season. If you choose to follow, The trail will test your commitment more severely than anything you have yet endured. If you choose otherwise, I will guide you to the nearest settlement before departing." Jacob felt the weight of decision settling on his young shoulders. At 10 years old, he was being asked to choose not just immediate survival strategy, but the fundamental direction of his entire life. The analytical part of his mind catalogued risks and benefits, but his deeper instincts responded to something in Many Horses' presence that promised extraordinary possibilities. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "what do you think?" His sister's response reflected the same intuitive perception that had kept them alive through their darkest trials. "I think we died back at the trading post with Mama and Papa. Everything since then has been a different life, and different lives require different choices." She stood with renewed strength and faced Many Horses directly. "We want to learn everything you can teach us. We want to become strong enough to make sure what happened to our family never happens to anyone else." Many Horses nodded with obvious approval, but his expression remained serious. "Then know this: the path ahead will transform you into something your parents could never have imagined. You will gain abilities that few humans ever develop, but you will also carry responsibilities that will sometimes feel overwhelming." Jacob made his decision with the same systematic thinking that had guided their survival through 6 days of wilderness flight. They had nothing left in the white world except distant relatives who barely knew they existed. Many Horses offered not just survival, but the possibility of becoming something powerful enough to matter in a violent world that devoured the weak. "We choose the path of learning," Jacob announced formally. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs." Many Horses smiled for the first time since their meeting began, and the expression transformed his weathered features with surprising warmth. "Then you are no longer Jacob and Rebecca Henderson, orphaned children seeking rescue. You are White Hawk and Swift Deer, students of the sacred mysteries and inheritors of an ancient destiny." The new names resonated through both children with shocking power, as though dormant aspects of their identities had suddenly awakened. Jacob, now White Hawk, felt his perception of the world around him sharpen and expand in ways he couldn't understand but immediately embraced. Rebecca, now Swift Deer, experienced a similar transformation as her already strong intuitive abilities deepened into something approaching genuine prescience. She could sense patterns of probability and possibility that existed beyond normal human awareness. "How do you know our true names?" Swift Deer asked with wonder. "The vision stones told me during the night while you slept," Many Horses replied. "Ancient spirits whispered the names that would awaken the power sleeping within your blood. You carry the legacy of warriors and visionaries from many lifetimes, now ready to manifest in this time of great change." As they prepared to follow Many Horses toward an uncertain but extraordinary future, White Hawk felt the last vestiges of his childhood innocence dissolving. The boy who had hidden in terror beneath an overturned wagon was being replaced by someone harder, stronger, and infinitely more dangerous. The journey to Many Horses' hidden stronghold took 3 days of travel that tested the twins' endurance in entirely new ways. Unlike their desperate flight from the massacre site, this trek was conducted with systematic precision that prioritized stealth and education over speed. Many Horses led them through terrain that seemed impassable to untrained eyes. Hidden valleys that didn't appear on any white man's maps, ancient game trails that wound through seemingly solid rock formations, secret water sources that had sustained his people for countless generations. Every mile revealed knowledge that transformed the twins' understanding of the land they had thought they knew. "Territory doesn't exist in nature," Many Horses explained as they navigated a particularly challenging passage between towering stone formations. "Only humans draw lines on maps and claim ownership of what cannot be possessed. The earth recognizes no boundaries except those created by water, wind, and time. Whitehawk found himself memorizing every landmark and geographical feature with enhanced precision that seemed to exceed his previous capabilities. His analytical mind now processed spatial relationships and navigational data with efficiency that bordered on supernatural. The vision stone seemed to amplify his natural abilities while adding entirely new forms of perception. Swift Deer experienced even more dramatic changes as her intuitive gifts expanded into realms that challenged her understanding of reality. She began sensing the emotional and spiritual history of places they passed, areas where great violence had occurred, sacred sites that held accumulated power from generations of ceremony, even simple locations where acts of kindness or courage had left permanent impressions on the land itself. Everything that happens leaves traces, many horses confirmed when Swift Deer described her experiences. Most people cannot read these traces, but you are learning to see the invisible threads that connect all events across time. On their second day of travel, they encountered evidence that they were being pursued. Many horses detected the signs. First, disturbed vegetation, displaced stones, subtle alterations in natural patterns that indicated trained trackers following their route with professional skill. Iron Snake Gang? Whitehawk asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the revolver that many horses had allowed him to keep. Many horses studied the trail signs with grim concentration before shaking his head. Different. These tracks belong to territorial marshals or army scouts, skilled men following orders rather than criminals following profit. The realization that they were being hunted by law enforcement rather than outlaws created complex new challenges. The twins had assumed that their status as massacre survivors would guarantee protection from territorial authorities. Learning that they were instead being pursued as fugitives forced them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about their situation. "Why would marshals be hunting us?" Swift Deer asked with growing alarm. Many Horse's expression darkened as he considered possibilities that clearly troubled him. Someone wants to control the story of what happened at Henderson Trading Post. Witnesses who tell truth can be inconvenient for those who prefer their own version of events. The implications struck Whitehawk with devastating clarity. If corrupt officials or Iron Snake Gang collaborators had convinced territorial authorities that the twins posed some kind of threat, their former assumption of safety among their own people was not only wrong, but potentially deadly. "Then we can never go back," Swift Deer said quietly, grasping the full scope of their transformation. "We really are starting completely new lives." Many horses nodded solemnly. This is why the old ways become necessary. When the new world offers only corruption and violence, ancient wisdom provides alternatives that create different possibilities. They reached the sacred caves as sunset painted the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed almost supernatural. The entrance was so perfectly concealed that Whitehawk would have walked past it without recognition, despite standing less than 10 feet away. Many horses had to point out specific rock formations and vegetation patterns before the twins could even identify where the opening lay hidden. "See with more than eyes," many horses instructed as he demonstrated the sequence of movements required to reveal the entrance. "The caves hide themselves from those who come with wrong intentions. Only people carrying proper spirit can find the way inside." The passage beyond the concealed entrance opened into a vast underground complex that exceeded anything the twins had imagined possible. Ancient geological forces had carved cathedral-like chambers from solid rock, while generations of many horses' people had modified the natural formations to create a hidden sanctuary that could shelter dozens of people indefinitely. But most remarkably, the caves were far from empty. As their eyes adjusted to the soft light provided by carefully placed torches, White Hawk and Swift Deer found themselves surrounded by approximately 30 Ojibwe men, women, and children who regarded the newcomers with expressions ranging from curiosity to obvious suspicion. "My people," many horses announced with quiet pride, "I present White Hawk and Swift Deer, survivors of the Henderson Trading Post massacre, bearers of the ancient vision stones, and students of the mysteries that will reshape our understanding of what becomes possible when enemies learn to see each other as allies." The response was immediate and divided. Some of the gathered Ojibwe nodded with apparent approval, while others exchanged glances that clearly expressed serious reservations about bringing white children into their most sacred sanctuary. An elderly woman with intricate tattoos covering her weathered hands stepped forward with obvious authority. "Many horses, have your visions clouded your judgment? These are white children, no matter what names the spirits whisper. How can you trust them with knowledge that our people have protected for generations?" Many horses' response carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Because the time for protecting secrets in isolation has ended, wise grandmother. The prophecies speak of a great darkness coming that will destroy all peoples, unless ancient wisdom and new knowledge join together. These children carry the potential to build bridges that neither red nor white people can construct alone." The debate that followed would determine not only the twins' immediate fate, but the direction of both their destinies and the hidden community's future, in a world increasingly hostile to traditional ways of life. The debate over White Hawk and Swift Deer's fate raged through the night in the sacred caves, with voices rising and falling in passionate Ojibwe that the twins could only partially understand. Many horses served as translator during key moments, but much of the discussion remained beyond their comprehension, leaving them to read emotional undercurrents and body language to gauge their chances of acceptance. Wise grandmother, whose tribal name was Singing Crow, led the opposition with arguments that carried decades of accumulated wisdom and bitter experience. Her weathered voice echoed through the cavern as she recounted betrayals by white allies, broken treaties, and promises of friendship that had ended in violence and displacement. "Every white child grows into a white adult," she declared with passionate conviction. "Their hearts may begin pure, but their people's teachings poison them with beliefs that make them see us as less than human. How many times must we learn this lesson written in our children's blood?" A younger warrior named Bearclaw supported her position with tactical arguments that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the political realities facing indigenous peoples throughout the territory. "We cannot risk exposing our sanctuary to those who may someday serve the authorities, hunting our families. These children have seen our sacred places, learned our secret trails. What happens when they choose their birth people over their adopted ones?" But many horses had allies within the community whose voices carried equal weight. Stone Walker, an elderly medicine man whose spiritual authority rivaled Singing Crow's political influence, spoke in favor of accepting the twins with mystical certainty that commanded respectful attention. "The vision stones have not awakened for 7 generations, he announced, his ancient voice carrying profound authority. "They were created specifically for 2 children, whose spirits would bridge worlds during a time of great darkness. If we reject these young ones, we reject the prophecies that have guided our people for more generations than any of us have lived." Moonshadow, a woman warrior whose tactical brilliance had kept their band free when other Ojibwe groups faced forced relocation, provided practical arguments that complemented Stonewalker's spiritual reasoning. "These children have already proven their courage and resilience. They survived what killed adults, escaped professional killers, and endured 6 days of wilderness with nothing but their determination. Such spirits deserve our respect regardless of the color of their skin." White Hawk listened to the debate with growing appreciation for the complexity of the decision facing the community. He had initially assumed that many horses' leadership would automatically guarantee their acceptance, but the democratic process playing out around them demonstrated sophisticated governance that valued diverse perspectives over simple autocracy. Swift. Deer's enhanced intuitive abilities allowed her to perceive emotional and spiritual currents that shaped the discussion beyond mere words. She sensed genuine fear among those who opposed their acceptance, not fear of the twins themselves, but terror of consequences that might result from trusting outsiders in a world where such trust had historically led to devastating betrayal. "They're not arguing about us," she whispered to her brother during a brief pause in the debate. "They're arguing about hope versus safety, whether it's more dangerous to try building bridges or to remain isolated." The insight proved prophetic when Singing Crow addressed the twins directly, her weathered face showing struggle between wisdom and compassion. "Young ones, understand that our resistance comes not from hatred, but from love for our families and fear for their safety. We have lost too much to risk losing more for the sake of prophecies that may be misunderstood." Whitehawk found himself responding with respect that surprised even himself. "Honored grandmother, we understand your fear because we share it. Our family trusted in peace and neutrality, believing that fairness would protect us from violence. We learned that some people cannot be reasoned with or appeased. But we also learned that survival sometimes requires alliances that seem impossible." His words carried weight because they demonstrated understanding rather than merely requesting acceptance. The 10-year-old boy was acknowledging the legitimate concerns of people whose experience provided every reason for caution. Swift Deer's contribution shifted the debate's emotional tenor by addressing fears that hadn't been spoken aloud. "We know we may never be fully trusted by some of you, and we understand why, but we also know that we can never return to the white world. The people hunting us won't stop until we're silenced forever. This community is our only chance for life, and your teaching is our only chance to become strong enough to survive what's coming." Many horses had remained silent during the extended debate, allowing his people to work through their concerns without pressure from his authority. But when the discussion began circling without resolution, he finally spoke with quiet conviction that commanded immediate attention. "The vision stones have made their choice," he said simply. "They respond only to spirits destined for this path. We can debate prophecies and fear consequences, but the sacred objects themselves have already provided the answer we seek." Stonewalker nodded with obvious approval and withdrew 2 additional items from his medicine bundle, carved wooden staffs that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "These are teaching staffs, created by the same ancestors who made the vision stones. They have waited 7 generations for students capable of using them properly." The elderly medicine man offered the staffs to Whitehawk and Swift Deer with ceremonial solemnity. "If the spirits accept you, the staffs will awaken and begin your true education. If they reject you, we will know that our caution was wise." Whitehawk accepted his staff with trembling hands, immediately feeling warmth spread through his fingers as the carved wood seemed to recognize his touch. Symbols along its length began glowing with soft blue light, while his vision stone resonated, in harmony with energies he couldn't understand but definitely felt. Swift Deer's experience proved even more dramatic. The moment her fingers closed around her teaching staff, the entire cavern filled with ethereal music that seemed to emanate from the rock walls themselves. Her staff blazed with golden light that danced in patterns reminiscent of Aurora Borealis, while her vision stones sang with frequencies that touched every person present. The supernatural display ended all debate. Even Singing Crow bowed her head in acknowledgement that forces beyond human argument had spoken with unmistakable clarity. "The ancestors have chosen," she announced with dignified acceptance. We honor their wisdom and welcome Whitehawk and Swift Deer as members of our band. May they prove worthy of the gifts they have been given. Whitehawk and Swift Deer's formal education began the following morning with a ritual purification that marked their transition from refugees to students of ancient mysteries. Stone Walker conducted the ceremony beside an underground pool, whose waters remained perfectly clear, despite never seeing sunlight. The old learning requires empty vessels, he explained as he prepared herbs and sacred objects around the pool's edge. You must release the assumptions and limitations that define how white people see the world. Only then can true knowledge find space to grow within your minds. The purification process involved more than symbolic cleansing. As the twins immersed themselves in the sacred waters while Stone Walker chanted in ancient Ojibwe dialects, they experienced profound alterations in consciousness that opened channels of perception they had never known existed. Whitehawk felt his analytical mind expanding beyond simple problem-solving toward genuine understanding of interconnected systems. The mechanical aptitude that had allowed him to repair equipment now revealed itself as intuitive comprehension of how all things, living and non-living, functioned according to universal principles that operated at every scale from atoms to ecosystems. Swift Deer's transformation proved even more remarkable. Her existing empathic abilities deepened into something approaching telepathic connection with the natural world. She could sense the emotional states of animals, the health of plants, even the subtle spiritual energies that flowed through rock formations and water sources. This is only the beginning, Stone Walker warned, as they emerged from the pool feeling fundamentally changed. True mastery requires years of dedication and practice, but you now possess the foundation necessary for learning skills that will make you formidable allies and dangerous enemies. Many horses took over their training with systematic intensity that reflected his military background adapted for mystical education. Unlike typical white schooling that emphasized memorization and repetition, the Ojibwe approach focused on developing innate abilities through increasingly challenging practical applications. White man's education fills minds with other people's thoughts, many horses explained as he led them through their first morning exercises. Our education awakens the wisdom that already sleeps within your spirits. We do not teach you to think like us. We teach you to think like yourselves, but more clearly and powerfully. Whitehawk's lessons began with advanced understanding of natural mechanics, how river systems carved landscapes, how weather patterns developed and moved, how geological forces shaped terrain over vast periods of time. But this knowledge was taught through direct experience rather than theoretical study. Many horses would take him to specific locations where geological processes were actively occurring, teaching him to perceive forces and patterns that operated too slowly for normal observation. Using his enhanced analytical abilities and the teaching staff's power, Whitehawk learned to compress time perception and observe changes that typically required centuries to complete. Watch how water finds the weak points in stone. Many horses, instructed as they studied a cliff face where underground springs were gradually dissolving limestone formations. Understand that persistence defeats strength when properly applied. This principle governs warfare, diplomacy, and survival. Swift Deer's education followed parallel tracks that developed her empathic gifts toward practical applications that bordered on supernatural. Moonshadow served as her primary instructor in what the Ojibwe called spirit speaking, the ability to communicate with animals, plants, and even geological formations through direct consciousness transfer. Everything that exists possesses awareness appropriate to its nature, Moonshadow explained as they practiced beside a beaver pond. Rocks think slowly, trees think in seasons, animals think in moments. Learning to match their thought patterns allows communication that transcends the barriers between species. Swift Deer's first successful attempt at spirit speaking came when she established contact with a family of otters whose dam had been damaged by recent flooding. Through careful mental projection, she convinced them to relocate to a safer area, upstream, preventing their likely death when territorial hunters arrived seeking pelts. "How is this possible?" Swift Deer asked with wonder as she watched the otters swimming toward their new home. "All consciousness shares common origins," Moonshadow replied. "Separation between minds is illusion created by fear and ignorance. When you release the belief that you are isolated, connection becomes natural." By their third week in the sacred caves, both twins had developed abilities that exceeded anything their previous lives had prepared them to understand. Whitehawk could predict weather patterns weeks in advance by reading subtle atmospheric changes invisible to normal observation. More remarkably, he could identify optimal routes through unknown terrain by perceiving geological stability, water, availability, and tactical advantages that wouldn't become apparent to ordinary travelers until they encountered problems. Swift Deer's gifts proved even more dramatic. She could locate lost objects by sensing their emotional resonance with previous owners. She accurately predicted the intentions of strangers by reading the spiritual energies that surrounded all human beings. Most impressive, she could identify lies with perfect accuracy by perceiving the disharmony that deception created in people's energy fields. "These are not supernatural powers," Stonewalker emphasized when the twins expressed amazement at their developing capabilities. "They are natural abilities that all humans once possessed before civilization taught them to rely on crude tools rather than refined perception. You are simply remembering what your spirits always knew." The teaching staffs served as both amplifiers and training devices, allowing the twins to access increasingly sophisticated applications of their enhanced abilities. Whitehawk learned to use his staff to detect metal deposits underground, locate water sources at great distances, and even identify the emotional history of objects by reading traces left by previous handlers. Swift Deer's staff enabled her to project consciousness across vast distances, observing events occurring far beyond physical sight. She could monitor the movement of territorial patrols seeking their sanctuary, track the Iron Snake Gang's activities throughout the region, and even observe conditions at distant settlements. But these remarkable capabilities came with corresponding responsibilities that many horses emphasized through increasingly challenging training scenarios. The twins were required to use their abilities in service of community needs rather than personal advantage, demonstrating that power without wisdom led inevitably to corruption. Every gift carries the obligation to serve something larger than yourself, many horses declared during one of their evening instruction sessions. Power that serves only the self becomes poison that destroys both the user and everyone around them. This lesson gained profound significance when Swift Deer's long-range observation revealed disturbing developments in the outside world. Using her staff to monitor territorial activities, she discovered that Marshal Donovan had issued wanted posters describing the twins as dangerous fugitives who posed threats to public safety. "They're calling us accomplices to the massacre," she reported with growing alarm. "The posters claim we helped the Iron Snake Gang plan their attack and escaped with stolen money." Whitehawk felt rage building in his chest as he grasped the implications. Thornfield or his allies must have corrupted officials. They're using us as scapegoats to cover their own crimes. Many horses studied this intelligence with grim concentration that suggested even worse possibilities. Or territorial authorities have their own reasons for wanting you silenced. Men with guilty consciences often create elaborate lies to justify eliminating witnesses to their failures. The revelation transformed the twins' situation from temporary refuge to permanent exile. They could never safely return to white civilization while such lies circulated through official channels. Their only hope for eventual justice lay in developing abilities powerful enough to expose the truth despite institutional opposition. The twins' theoretical training became brutally practical when Swift Deer's surveillance detected a territorial patrol approaching their hidden valley with suspicious precision. The six-man unit was being guided by someone who clearly possessed detailed knowledge of traditional Ojibwe travel routes and sanctuary locations. Traitor among our people, many horses concluded after studying the patrol's movement patterns. Only someone from our tribe could guide them so accurately through terrain that conceals itself from outsiders. The discovery struck the community like a physical blow. The sacred caves had remained hidden for over a century through careful secrecy and traditional protections. Learning that someone from their own band had betrayed their location to territorial authorities challenged fundamental assumptions about loyalty and trust. Singing Crow's response was swift and uncompromising. This proves the danger of accepting outsiders. Someone leaked information about the white children, bringing soldiers to our most sacred place. But many horses' analysis suggested more complex motivations. The timing is too convenient. This betrayal was planned before White Hawk and Swift Deer arrived. Someone has been feeding information to territorial authorities for weeks or months. The community faced immediate decisions that would determine not only their survival, but their ability to maintain the hidden sanctuary that represented generations of accumulated sacred knowledge. They could attempt to defend the caves against superior firepower, relocate deeper into wilderness areas that offered fewer resources, or try to eliminate the threat through strategic action that prevented future betrayals. White Hawk felt his enhanced analytical abilities, engaging with problems that combined military tactics, resource management, and political consequences. The teaching staff seemed to amplify his natural strategic thinking, allowing him to perceive solutions that addressed multiple aspects of their crisis simultaneously. "The patrol is still 2 days away," he announced, after studying Swift Deer's surveillance reports. "We have time to prepare responses that could neutralize the threat without direct confrontation." Swift Deer's empathic abilities provided crucial intelligence about the approaching soldiers' mental states and intentions. They're not planning arrests. Their emotions carry the anticipation of violence. They intend to kill everyone they find. This revelation eliminated any possibility of peaceful resolution. The territorial patrol was conducting an extermination mission rather than law enforcement operation, confirming that powerful forces wanted the twins and their protectors permanently silenced. Many horses called for an emergency council that would determine their response using traditional democratic processes adapted for their extraordinary circumstances. But he also began preparing the twins for their first real application of the abilities they had been developing. "Theory becomes practice when survival depends on performance," he told them as evening shadows filled the cavern. "Tomorrow you will discover whether your training has prepared you to protect what matters most." The community's decision came. After hours of intense debate that reflected the same democratic principles that had governed their acceptance of the twins. But the conclusion was unanimous. They would use their enhanced capabilities and traditional knowledge to neutralize the threat while exposing the traitor who had endangered their sanctuary. White Hawk and Swift Deer would play central roles in an operation that would test every skill they had acquired while determining whether their transformation from terrified refugees to empowered guardians was complete enough to handle deadly challenges. As they prepared for their first real mission, both twins understood that their childhood was ending forever. The frightened children who had hidden beneath an overturned wagon were being replaced by something far more dangerous. young warriors whose unique combination of abilities could reshape the balance of power in a territory where violence had become the only language that competing factions understood. The sacred caves had given them sanctuary, knowledge, and purpose. Now it was time to prove they deserved the gifts they had received by using them to protect the people who had risked everything to help them survive. Dawn broke grey and ominous over the sacred caves as many horses gathered his most trusted warriors for the operation that would determine their community's survival. But before they could address the approaching territorial patrol, they needed to identify and neutralize the traitor whose betrayal had brought death to their sanctuary's doorstep. Swift Deer sat in deep meditation beside the underground pool. Her consciousness expanded through her teaching staff to probe the spiritual energies of every community member. The process required extraordinary delicacy. She had to detect deception without alerting the guilty party to her investigation. White Hawk assisted his sister's investigation by using his enhanced analytical abilities to review the patrol's approach route with mathematical precision. His teaching staff allowed him to perceive patterns in the soldiers' movement that revealed intimate knowledge of traditional Ojibwe travel corridors and sacred site locations. "They're not following obvious trails," he reported to many horses. After hours of detailed analysis, their route avoids every natural pathway that outsiders would discover through normal exploration. Someone provided them with information that could only come from our own people. Swift Deer's spiritual investigation eliminated several suspects within hours. Their energy fields showed emotional complexity, doubt, fear, even anger, but none of the corruption that accompanied deliberate betrayal. But one individual's spiritual signature proved deeply troubling, showing layers of concealment that suggested sophisticated efforts to hide true intentions. "Broken Arrow," she whispered to many horses with painful certainty. "He's learned to mask his thoughts from spiritual detection, but the effort itself creates distortions that reveal guilty knowledge. He's been planning this betrayal for weeks." Many horses received this intelligence with the stoic acceptance of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from those closest to him. His weathered face showed pain, but no surprise. The war chief had survived too many betrayals to be shocked by one more. "Broken Arrow lost his wife and children during the Leech Lake massacre," many horses explained to the twins. "Territorial. Authorities promised him compensation and protection if he provided intelligence about remaining resistance groups. Grief can poison the spirit as surely as any physical wound." The confrontation came that evening as the community prepared for the approaching crisis. Many horses approached his nephew with ceremonial formality that allowed Broken Arrow to maintain dignity even while facing exposure as a traitor. "Nephew, the spirits have shown us troubling visions. They speak of divided loyalties and promises made in desperation. Is there something you wish to confess before the ancestors judge your actions?" Broken Arrow's composure cracked like ice in spring flood. The young warrior's shoulders sagged as months of accumulated guilt finally overwhelmed his ability to maintain deception. "Uncle, I never intended for anyone to be harmed. The marshals promised they only wanted the white children. They said our people would be left in peace if I provided information about the twins' location. And you believed men who have broken every treaty they ever signed with our people?" many horses asked with quiet disappointment rather than anger. "I believed them because I wanted to believe them," Broken Arrow replied with devastating honesty. "Because my family's ghosts whisper that any chance for peace is worth the risk of betrayal." The revelation that territorial authorities specifically sought the twins rather than the entire community added crucial context to their situation. White Hawk and Swift Deer represented some kind of unique threat that motivated extraordinary efforts to eliminate them permanently. "What exactly did the marshals tell you about us?" Swift Deer asked, her empathic abilities detecting layers of information that Broken Arrow hadn't consciously processed. They said you possessed evidence that could destroy important people, Broken Arrow answered slowly. That your continued existence threatened the stability of territorial government and the peace between white and Indian peoples. Whitehawk felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place with mathematical precision. We don't possess any evidence except our witness testimony about the massacre, unless... He paused as understanding struck with devastating clarity. Unless someone important was involved in planning the Iron Snake Gang's attack. Someone who can't afford to have survivors expose their complicity. The Territorial Patrol arrived at sunset, 6 heavily armed men led by a sergeant, whose military bearing suggested extensive frontier combat experience. But their confident approach to what they believed was a helpless Indian camp revealed fatal underestimation of their opponent's capabilities. Whitehawk and Swift Deer had spent the afternoon using their enhanced abilities to prepare an ambush that combined traditional Ojibwe tactics with supernatural advantages that no territorial force had ever encountered. Their plan required precise coordination between mystical perception and practical action. Swift Deer positioned herself on a concealed ledge overlooking the valley approach, her teaching staff allowing her to monitor the patrol's emotional states, while projecting false images that would lead them into the prepared killing ground. Her spirit-speaking abilities enabled communication with local wildlife that could provide additional confusion and misdirection. Whitehawk took position near the valley floor with several Ojibwe warriors, his enhanced analytical perception allowing him to calculate optimal firing positions, escape routes, and coordination timing with mathematical precision. His teaching staff helped him perceive the geological weak points that could be exploited to create natural barriers and tactical advantages. Many horses commanded the operation from a central position that allowed communication with all elements, while maintaining flexibility to respond to unexpected developments. But the war chief's primary responsibility was protecting the twins during their first real combat application of abilities that remained largely untested under life-threatening conditions. The Territorial Patrol entered the valley with the overconfidence of men who believed they faced primitive opponents armed with obsolete weapons. Sergeant Morrison, the unit commander, had been told to expect a small band of renegade Indians hiding 2 fugitive children in a makeshift camp. Instead, they encountered something that challenged their understanding of what was possible. Swift Deer's first contribution came when she convinced a family of black bears to emerge from their den and cross the patrol's path at precisely the right moment. The massive animal's appearance forced the soldiers to dismount and seek cover, disrupting their formation while creating psychological pressure that compromised their tactical coordination. Whitehawk used this confusion to signal Ojibwe warriors positioned throughout the valley. His enhanced perception allowed him to coordinate their movements with split-second timing that maximized surprise while minimizing risk to their own forces. The battle that followed lasted less than 10 minutes, but demonstrated capabilities that would have seemed impossible to observers from either culture. Swift Deer projected fear and confusion directly into the soldiers' minds, causing them to fire at shadows while their real opponents moved with supernatural stealth. Whitehawk used his geological understanding to trigger a controlled rock slide that eliminated 3 enemies without exposing any Ojibwe fighters to return fire. But the most shocking moment came when Sergeant Morrison, wounded and desperate, managed to corner Swift Deer in a narrow canyon where her mobility was limited. The grizzled veteran raised his rifle with the cold precision of someone who had killed many people and felt no hesitation about adding a 10-year-old girl to his tally. Swift Deer's response transcended anything her previous training had prepared. Her Faced with imminent death, her teaching staff blazed with golden light that seemed to pierce directly into Morrison's consciousness. The sergeant's rifle fell from nerveless fingers as his mind was flooded with visions of every person he had ever killed, every family he had destroyed, every act of cruelty he had committed during his military career. Morrison collapsed to his knees, sobbing with remorse that 20 years of violence had never allowed him to feel. "What have I done?" he whispered repeatedly. "Dear God, what have I done?" The spiritual assault left Swift Deer drained but victorious. She had discovered that her empathic abilities could be weaponized to devastating effect, turning an enemy's own guilt and shame into paralyzing psychological weapons. The patrol's complete elimination provided immediate tactical victory. But searching their equipment revealed intelligence that transformed the twins' understanding of their situation from local persecution to territorial conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Among Sergeant Morrison's papers, Whitehawk discovered correspondence that connected their manhunt to Territorial Governor Harrison himself. The official who was supposed to represent justice and law enforcement was personally coordinating efforts to eliminate 2 children whose testimony could expose corruption that went far beyond simple complicity with outlaw gangs. "Look at this," Whitehawk called to many horses, his voice tight with rage as he read the damning documents. "Governor Harrison has been taking payments from the Iron Snake Gang for years. Our trading post was attacked because Papa refused to pay protection money to Thornfield's organization." Swift Deer's examination of the soldiers' equipment revealed even more disturbing evidence. Personal effects included jewelry and coins that she recognized from Henderson Trading Post inventory, items that could only have been obtained from the gang members who had massacred their family. These soldiers weren't just hunting us, she realized with growing horror. They were working directly with the Iron Snake Gang. The territorial government and the outlaws are the same organization. Many horses studied the evidence with grim satisfaction that their victory had produced intelligence crucial for understanding the true scope of their enemy's power. This explains why conventional law enforcement has been ineffective against Thornfield's operation. The gang operates with official protection from the highest levels of territorial authority. The revelation forced complete reconsideration of their strategic situation. They weren't fighting criminal outlaws who operated outside legal authority. They were opposing an integrated conspiracy that controlled both criminal organizations and government institutions throughout the territory. But the discovery also provided the twins with something they had lost during the massacre, the possibility of eventual justice for their family's murder. The evidence now in their possession could destroy Governor Harrison's administration while exposing the corruption that had protected the Iron Snake Gang for years. "We can't just hide anymore," Whitehawk declared with newfound determination. "We have proof that could free the entire territory from this conspiracy. We have to find a way to get this evidence to honest authorities." Swift Deer nodded, her empathic abilities detecting the righteous anger that burned within her brother's spirit. "But first, we have to survive long enough to use what we've learned. They'll send more soldiers when this patrol doesn't return." Many horses smiled with fierce pride as he witnessed the twins' transformation from refugees seeking safety to warriors planning offensive action against seemingly impossible odds. "Then we must ensure you become strong enough to face whatever they send next. Your training has prepared you for survival. Now you must learn the deeper mysteries that create victory against superior enemies." The sacred caves had given them sanctuary and basic abilities. The ambush had tested their combat effectiveness. But the real war for the territory's future was just beginning, and Whitehawk and Swift Deer would need every advantage their unique heritage could provide. 3 weeks after the Territorial Patrol's elimination, Swift Deer's long-range surveillance abilities detected ominous developments across the Minnesota Territory. Governor Harrison had declared martial law in response to what he termed escalating Indian terrorism, deploying military units throughout the region while issuing bounties that made the twins the most wanted fugitives in territorial history. $50,000 for information leading to our capture. Whitehawk read from the latest wanted poster that Swift Deer had observed during her spiritual reconnaissance. Dead or alive. They're not even pretending this is about justice anymore. But the governor's desperate response had created unexpected opportunities. His heavy-handed tactics were alienating settlers who had previously supported territorial authority, while his obvious corruption was becoming impossible to conceal from federal investigators arriving from Washington. Many horses studied intelligence. Reports gathered through Swift Deer's enhanced perception with the tactical mind that had kept his people free when other bands faced forced relocation. Harrison's desperation makes him predictable. He will concentrate forces around suspected Indian strongholds while neglecting security at territorial headquarters where the evidence we need is stored. The war chief's analysis revealed a crucial weakness in their enemy's strategy. Governor Harrison possessed the original documents that proved his collaboration with the Iron Snake Gang, but those records remained in his personal safe at the Territorial Capitol building in St. Paul. Capturing those documents would provide irrefutable proof of the conspiracy while eliminating Harrison's ability to destroy evidence of his crimes. But such an operation would require capabilities far beyond anything the twins had yet demonstrated. Infiltrating the territorial capital meant penetrating military security, navigating urban environments, and confronting enemies on their own ground, where traditional Ojibwe advantages would be neutralized. "We need allies," Swift Deer announced, after using her teaching staff to survey the broader political landscape. There are other resistance groups operating throughout the territory, displaced tribes, honest lawmen who've been marginalized by corruption, even some settler communities that have suffered under Harrison's protection racket. Her spiritual reconnaissance had detected patterns of organized opposition that suggested coordinated resistance was possible if proper leadership could unite the scattered elements. Whitehawk's analytical abilities confirmed her assessment through mathematical analysis of documented grievances and resource distributions. "The territory is ready for revolution," Whitehawk concluded. "Harrison's corruption has created more enemies than he can control, but someone needs to provide the spark that ignites organized uprising." Many horses nodded with grim satisfaction. "Then we must call a gathering of war chiefs, such as has not been seen since the days when our ancestors fought the blue coats who stole our lands. But this time, we fight not just for our own people, but for all peoples who choose justice over corruption." The war chiefs' gathering took place in a hidden valley 3 days' ride north of the sacred caves, where ancient ceremonial grounds provided neutral territory for tribes that had sometimes warred against each other in previous generations. Many horses had sent messengers to every remaining independent band throughout the region, calling for unity against common enemies who threatened all indigenous peoples, regardless of tribal affiliation. Whitehawk and Swift Deer accompanied many horses as honored guests, whose unique abilities and intelligence about territorial corruption made them valuable contributors despite their youth and white heritage. But their presence at such a gathering represented unprecedented acceptance that demonstrated how desperate circumstances could overcome traditional prejudices. The assembled war chiefs represented the last free indigenous leadership in Minnesota territory. 12 men whose combined forces controlled perhaps 300 warriors, along with their families and supporters. Among them were legendary figures whose names were spoken with respect even by their enemies. Red Thunder of the Leech Lake Band, whose tactical brilliance had defeated 3 separate cavalry expeditions. Stone Bear of the White Earth people, whose spiritual power was said to make him invulnerable to bullets. Walking Wolf of the Sandy Lake group, whose knowledge of white man's politics rivaled that of territorial officials themselves. Brothers, many horses addressed the gathered chiefs with formal dignity befitting the historic nature of their meeting. We face enemies who use our people's blood to purchase their own wealth and power. But we also face opportunities such as, our ancestors could never have imagined, the chance to strike at corruption that poisons both red and white communities. White Hawk presented the evidence they had captured from the territorial patrol, his enhanced analytical abilities allowing him to explain the conspiracy's structure with mathematical precision that impressed warriors accustomed to thinking in tactical rather than political terms. The documents proved that Governor Harrison's administration had systematically betrayed both indigenous peoples and honest settlers for years. Swift Deer's contribution proved even more valuable. Using her empathic abilities to read the assembled chiefs' emotional responses, she identified which arguments would be most persuasive with each individual leader while detecting potential sources of discord that could undermine unity. War Chief Red Thunder values tactical advantage above all else, she whispered to many horses during a brief recess. Show him how our plan neutralizes superior numbers through surprise and coordination. Stone Bear responds to spiritual significance. Emphasize how this battle serves the ancestors' vision of justice. Walking Wolf needs to understand the political consequences. Explain how success creates lasting change rather than temporary victory. The strategic discussion that followed demonstrated sophisticated military thinking that combined traditional warfare principles with adaptation to modern weapons and communication systems. The assembled chiefs possessed collective experience, spanning decades of successful resistance against technically superior enemies. Red Thunder proposed a coordinated assault on multiple territorial installations simultaneously, preventing Harrison from concentrating his forces while creating widespread confusion that would multiply the psychological impact of their attacks. Strike everywhere at once. Make them believe our numbers are greater than reality. Stone Bear advocated for spiritual warfare alongside physical combat, using sacred ceremonies to demoralize enemies while strengthening their own warriors' resolve. Fear weakens the spirit before weapons touch the body. If we can make territorial soldiers doubt their cause, half our victory is already achieved. Walking Wolf focused on political strategy that would capitalize on military success to create lasting institutional change. We must ensure that honest federal authorities understand our actions serve justice rather than mere revenge. Documentation and witnesses will be as important as weapons for achieving permanent victory. The strategy that emerged from 2 days of intensive planning represented the most ambitious indigenous military operation since the Great Dakota Uprising of 1862. But unlike previous conflicts that had focused on driving white settlers from traditional territories, this campaign aimed to expose and eliminate corruption while preserving peaceful coexistence between honest peoples of all backgrounds. The plan required simultaneous operations across the entire territory, coordinated, with split-second timing that would prevent territorial forces from responding effectively to any single attack. White Hawk's mathematical precision proved crucial for calculating travel times, communication delays, and coordination requirements that would make such complexity possible. Phase 1 involves Swift Deer using her spiritual abilities to identify and contact honest lawmen, displaced settlers, and federal investigators who could be trusted with evidence of the conspiracy. These allies would be positioned to assume authority when Harrison's corrupt administration collapsed. Phase 2 required diversionary attacks on military installations throughout the territory, conducted by war parties led by the assembled chiefs. These operations would draw territorial forces away from St. Paul while creating the impression of general uprising that would panic Harrison into making mistakes. Phase 3 represented the most dangerous element. White Hawk and Swift Deer would infiltrate the territorial capital building during the chaos, using their supernatural abilities to penetrate security systems and retrieve the documentary evidence that could prove the conspiracy's existence to federal authorities. "You're asking children to attempt what trained soldiers would consider suicide," Walking Wolf observed when the full plan was revealed. "The Capitol building houses the territorial garrison's headquarters. Even with diversionary attacks, security will be formidable." Many horses had anticipated this objection. These are not ordinary children. Their abilities exceed anything territorial forces have encountered or prepared to counter. What appears impossible to normal perception becomes achievable when supernatural advantages are properly applied. To demonstrate his confidence in the twins' capabilities, many horses arranged a practical test that would convince the skeptical chiefs while providing additional training for the mission ahead. White Hawk and Swift Deer would attempt to infiltrate and gather intelligence from Fort Ridgely, a heavily defended military installation that served as regional headquarters for territorial forces. If they can penetrate Fort Ridgely's security undetected, they possess the skills necessary for the capital mission, many horses declared. "If they cannot, we will know our plan requires modification before attempting the real operation." The challenge accepted, White Hawk and Swift Deer began preparing for an infiltration mission that would test every ability they had developed, while providing crucial experience for the ultimate operation that could determine the territory's future. Fort Ridgely stood on a bluff overlooking the Minnesota River, its stone walls and strategic position making it one of the most formidable military installations in the territory. The fort housed nearly 200 soldiers, along with artillery pieces capable of devastating any conventional assault, while its intelligence operations coordinated territorial security throughout the region. White Hawk approached the reconnaissance mission with systematic analysis that identified patterns in guard rotations, supply deliveries, and communication schedules. His enhanced perception allowed him to detect structural weaknesses in the fort's design that could be exploited by infiltrators with supernatural abilities. Swift Deer's contribution focused on psychological intelligence gathered through empathic surveillance of the garrison's emotional climate. Her spiritual abilities revealed that morale among honest soldiers was deteriorating as they became aware of their commander's corruption, creating potential allies within the fort itself. "Half the enlisted men suspect their officers are criminals," she reported after 3 days of careful observation. "They joined the army to serve justice, not to protect thieves and murderers. Some of them might help us if approached properly." The infiltration attempt began at midnight during a supply convoy's arrival when normal security procedures were disrupted by cargo inspection requirements. White Hawk used his geological perception to identify underground passages that connected the fort's foundations to natural cave systems, allowing access that bypassed perimeter defenses entirely. Swift Deer's role required her to project false, sensory impressions that would make guards perceive empty corridors where the twins actually moved. Her empathic abilities also allowed her to detect approaching patrols before visual contact, providing advance warning that kept them concealed. Throughout their penetration, the intelligence they gathered exceeded all expectations. Fort Ridgely's files contained complete records of Harrison's correspondence with the Iron Snake Gang, detailed payment schedules for protection services, and most damning orders for the elimination of potential witnesses, including the Henderson family specifically. But their greatest discovery came when Swift Deer's spiritual surveillance detected a prisoner being held in the fort's basement cells, Captain Jonathan Mercer, a federal investigator who'd been secretly gathering evidence of territorial corruption before being arrested on fabricated charges. "We can't leave him here," Swiftdeer declared, after sensing the federal agent's desperate situation. "He knows things that could help expose the entire conspiracy, but Harrison's people plan to execute him within days." Whitehawk's analytical mind immediately grasped the strategic significance of rescuing Mercer while recognizing the operational complications such action would create. Extracting a prisoner changes this from reconnaissance to active combat. We'll lose the element of surprise that makes our main mission possible. The decision they faced would determine not only Mercer's fate, but the entire trajectory of their war against territorial corruption. Success could provide a crucial ally with federal authority and inside knowledge. Failure could expose their capabilities while alerting enemies to their true objectives. Whitehawk and Swiftdeer faced their most critical decision in the basement corridors of Fort Ridgely, where Captain Jonathan Mercer's imprisonment represented both unprecedented opportunity and catastrophic risk. The federal investigator possessed knowledge that could legitimize their entire resistance movement, but attempting his rescue would expose their supernatural abilities to territorial forces. Swiftdeer's empathic connection with the imprisoned agent revealed desperate urgency. "He knows about federal reinforcements coming from Washington," she whispered as they crouched outside Mercer's cell. "But Harrison plans to execute him tomorrow and claim he died attempting escape. If we don't act tonight, the evidence dies with him." Whitehawk's analytical mind processed the tactical implications. Mercer's rescue would compromise their primary mission against the territorial capital, but his testimony could provide federal legitimacy that would make evidence gathering unnecessary. "We save him," Whitehawk decided with newfound authority, "but we create maximum chaos for Harrison's forces while preserving our abilities for the larger operation." Their rescue plan combined supernatural capabilities with psychological warfare designed to terrorize Fort Ridgely's garrison. Swiftdeer would project mass hallucinations, making every soldier see different threats simultaneously, while Whitehawk used geological manipulation to create structural failures that seemed like divine intervention. The operation began at 3 in the morning. Swiftdeer positioned herself in the fort's chapel, where spiritual resonance amplified her empathic abilities to affect the entire installation. Her teaching staff blazed with golden light as she projected visions of ghostly children throughout the fort. Pale figures appearing in corridors, barracks, and command posts with supernatural consistency. Soldiers woke to find spectral twins standing beside their beds, watching with accusing eyes. Officers discovered the ghostly children in private quarters, silent until approached, then vanishing with whispers about justice. Guards reported phantoms walking through walls, appearing in secured areas where no living person could penetrate. Whitehawk's geological perception allowed him to identify stress points in the fort's construction, creating spectacular failures that appeared supernatural. Walls cracked without cause, floors collapsed in patterns that spelled accusations, even the fort's well ran red with water that tasted of blood. The combination shattered the garrison's psychological cohesion within. Hours. Hardened soldiers found themselves paralyzed by supernatural phenomena that challenged reality itself. Captain Mercer proved to be a federal investigator whose authority had been insufficient to protect him from territorial corruption, but whose knowledge represented the key to exposing the entire conspiracy. "Henderson children," he whispered as they appeared in his cell. "My God, you're alive! I've been investigating your family's case for months. Your parents were heroes who died trying to expose corruption reaching to Washington." Mercer's revelation transformed their understanding of their family's murder from random violence to systematic elimination of witnesses to federal crimes. Samuel Henderson had discovered territorial officials embezzling funds intended for Indian treaty payments, using the Iron Snake Gang to eliminate threats. "Your father was preparing testimony for Congress when the gang attacked," Mercer explained. As they escaped through chaos-consumed corridors, he had documented over $2 million stolen from federal accounts, enough to bring down Harrison's entire administration and several congressmen. Whitehawk demonstrated his geological abilities by opening passages through the fort's foundation, revealing natural cave systems no architect had discovered. The supernatural display convinced Mercer that the twins represented far more than fortunate survivors. Federal authorities need to understand that indigenous peoples possess capabilities our government has never acknowledged, Mercer declared. "Your abilities could revolutionize territorial administration. You're proof that cooperation offers advantages military conquest can never achieve." The coordinated uprising